It's time for the Super Dungeon Maker review for the Nintendo Switch. The whole idea of a Zelda dungeon creator is quite interesting to me, and while Dante's attraction is a step in the right direction, I still feel disappointed in what we got. Perhaps one day we'll get what I really want. Well, let's see how it turned out. When you first begin, you're immediately dropped into a tutorial dungeon where you learn the basics of controlling Fink, the main character of the game. Upon exiting, you see that you're in a small village with other areas to explore and NPCs that can give you basic tips when building your own dungeon. There's also a dedicated builder tutorial, which is only helpful to an extent. Honestly, I had to watch YouTube tutorials to help better explain what tools the builder gives you. The first thing you might notice is just how large your dungeons can be. There are a handful of potential floors to use, and the size of each floor is quite huge. Unless your goal is to force the player to spend a half hour on each floor, you won't be limited by how much physical space you can build. Unfortunately, the variety of items, objects, and enemies isn't the same. There's a small handful of each, and this is one of the most disappointing elements of the game. There needs to be at least 2 times the amount of usable and collectible items, at least 3 times the amount of different types of normal enemies, and a minimum of 2 more unique boss enemies would be helpful. Heck, I'd settle for at least 2 mini-bosses to choose from. Recycling the same enemies throughout a dungeon gets boring, and if you're familiar with Zelda bosses, you won't find much challenge or spectacle when facing these guys. You can choose a different theme for your dungeon, which is nice as many of the scenery aesthetic objects change to match the style, but unfortunately enemies don't. The dungeon I built here has various enemies that seem to be appropriate for a desert-themed dungeon, but having these same types in a castle or ice theme doesn't really fit. Also, only one theme can be chosen per dungeon. It would be great and increase the spectacle of your dungeons if you could change the theme per floor, but as of this review, you're only allowed one theme per level. The best thing about the game is the use of triggers. Here you can set up puzzles for your players to interact with. Unlike the items and enemies, there's a good variety of different types of triggers to use which can give you the potential to come up with many different combinations. There's 2 things, as of this review though, that needs to be available. 1, there's no function to have the objects or enemies appear after the player has defeated specific enemies except with bosses. Like here, I wanted a chest to appear after these enemies are defeated, but I can't set this up, so I instead had to settle for a floor trigger to make the chest appear. I can make objects appear after certain waves with bosses, but I should be able to accomplish this with normal enemies as well. And 2, like with bosses, there needs to be the ability to give sub-triggers to any object, enemy, or base triggers. So right here, I wanted the sequence of events to be that after the player defeats these 2 enemies, an object trigger would appear, and if the player interacts with it, a chest would appear. I guess I want a sequencer that can let me say, if this, then this, and if this, then this. Dungeon creation would be more fun and complex for the player if this was a reality, but unfortunately this is not the case. Don't get me wrong, there's quite a lot of different scenarios and combinations you can create that can challenge the player, but it can begin to feel stale due to the lack of variety of objects, items, and enemies, as well as the limitation of the triggering sequence available. Another gripe is how the player completes the level. Well, actually, it's not how they complete it, it's where they complete it. The goal of every dungeon is to find the golden egg. The problem is the location of the egg. It must stay on the first floor. Once the player knows this, the level of spectacle in searching for it diminishes since they ultimately know it's always on the first floor. The player may not know how to reach it immediately, but the fact that you can't move it to different floors is just really odd and annoying. Now I know I've basically been negative throughout most of this review, but I assure you that the game is fun if you're into creating your own levels. I understand this might not be for everyone, but if you enjoy sandbox creation games, you should enjoy this one too. It's funny because I don't usually like sandbox games, but I've always been interested in level design, and this game is a good first step in understanding how to create them and what makes a level challenging yet enjoyable. You'll definitely want another person playing your level so you can understand their perspective. I had Lizzie and Red play this level separately, and it was interesting to see the differences in playstyle. Lizzie doesn't have much practice with top-down adventure games, while Red is highly experienced. They both gave me opportunities to understand their different playstyles, which in turn helped me edit certain elements and areas so that both newcomers and gaming veterans could enjoy the level. The graphics and controls are very well done. The animations for Fink are fluid, however my brother and I noticed the screen would slightly shake when combating enemies, which was annoying and it couldn't be turned off. There's also quite a few glitches here and there, one being sometimes the text from an item's description won't go away when you test your level, forcing you to save and exit, then come back if you want it gone. Another was in the Hall of Fame area, where certain Kickstarter backers levels are given a special place to show off. Thing is, once you enter this place, you can't get back out, and yes, you have to restart the game. The small amount of content and the glitches that take place just makes me feel like the game is in a late beta mode, and perhaps shouldn't have been released without at least fixing the glitches first. The controls take some getting used to. You use a pointer for everything while in build mode, and this is just not the way the game should be played, at least on a console. I understand it was originally a PC game, but if you're going to put it on a console, the controls need to be optimized for console play. It needs to have a similar design to that of Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 on Switch, where in order to access menus, you need to first hold down a button to highlight all the menu options, then make your selections with the analog stick or D-pad. A huge miss is the fact that the Switch version doesn't have touchscreen controls. That should be a given. Once you're satisfied with your level, you can upload it to a server for others to enjoy, and you can play other dungeons as well. Unlike Super Mario Maker, there aren't any checks and balances to make sure players can actually beat the dungeon, or at the very least, complete the level without any major errors, like right here. You can send a message to the devs about the level, which, I don't know if it helps, but it's there if you decide to use it. Super Dungeon Maker feels like a great step in the right direction for the game that it is, but it overall just feels unfinished. It has great potential, but in order to get there, in my opinion, 3 things need to happen. 1, there needs to be more objects, items, and enemies to increase variety and help make the building process not feel stale. 2, the usage of sub-triggers on any interactable asset would greatly increase the complexity of building dungeons and can help increase overall enjoyment of gameplay for both the builder and the player. And 3, the controls need to be optimized for console play. While using the analog stick for everything isn't terrible, it just doesn't feel right, and especially for the Switch, touchscreen controls is almost a necessity. Overall, it's still a fun dungeon creator that can be especially beneficial to those who are interested in learning about level design. The game states at the beginning that the devs are constantly working on improvements, which is good, and the potential to be a great dungeon builder is there, but as of right now, it's just okay. This game gets a 3 out of 5 with the title of Passable.